The hallways of Westfield Corporate Plaza were always quieter at night. That's how Frank liked it. Just him, his cleaning cart, and the soft hum of the floor polisher. The fancy building stood tall in downtown Chicago, its windows still lit up, here and there with people working late. Frank knew each of those offices by heart after cleaning them for almost 4 years now. At 42, Frank's hands told their own story. They were rough from years of hard work, with calluses that no amount of lotion could soften, but those same hands could be gentle too, when they braided his daughter Penny's hair for school, or when they carefully tucked her in at night. Tonight was like most nights. Frank had walked Penny over to Mrs. Rivera's apartment down the hall at 7:30. The kind older woman had been watching Penny during Frank's night shifts ever since they'd moved to the building. "She's no trouble," Mrs. Rivera always insisted. "She just sits and does her homework or reads those music books of hers." Frank smiled at the thought of his daughter as he emptied another trash can. Penny was 12 now, growing up so fast it sometimes scared him. She had her mother's eyes, deep brown and thoughtful, and the same passion for music that had drawn Frank to Rachel in the first place. Rachel, even after 3 years thinking about her, still felt like pressing on a bruise. The cancer had moved so quickly. One day they were planning a family vacation, and 6 months later, Frank was planning a funeral. The medical bills had wiped out their savings, and Frank had been forced to sell their small house in the suburbs. The piano, too, that beautiful upright that Rachel had treasured, had been sold to pay for the final hospital stay. Frank pushed his cleaning cart toward the executive bathrooms. Everything in this part of the building screamed money. Marble countertops, fancy soap dispensers, even the toilet paper seemed more expensive. Frank sometimes wondered what it would be like to earn in a day what he made in a month. Before Rachel got sick, Frank had been a music teacher at a public high school. He'd taught piano and led the school choir. The pay hadn't been great, but with Rachel's job as a nurse, they'd made ends meet. There had been music in their home every day, Rachel singing while she cooked, Frank playing the piano while Penny danced around the living room. Now home was a small 2-bedroom apartment in a building that had seen better days. And instead of teaching kids about Mozart and Beethoven, Frank was scrubbing toilets used by people who barely noticed he existed, but he never complained. Not to Penny, not to Mrs. Rivera, not to anyone. Complaining wouldn't bring Rachel back. It wouldn't make money appear in their bank account. It wouldn't make his back hurt less after a long night of mopping floors, so Frank just kept going, one foot in front of the other, one day at a time. The only thing Frank refused to give up on was Penny's piano lessons, even when they had to move to the smaller apartment, even when he had to take on a second job delivering groceries on weekends. Frank made sure Penny could continue her lessons with Miss Chen at the community center. "She has real talent," Miss Chen had told him once. "The kind you can't teach. She feels the music." Frank knew it was true. He'd seen how Penny lost herself in the music, her small fingers dancing across the keys of the center's old piano. It was in those moments that she looked most like Rachel. As he finished cleaning the executive bathrooms, Frank checked his watch. Just past midnight. He still had the main lobby to mop and the CEO's office to vacuum. He wheeled his cart toward the elevator, nodding at the night security guard, Bill. "How's it going tonight, Frank?" Bill asked. The older man was one of the few people in the building who actually knew Frank's name. "Can't complain," Frank replied with his usual answer. "How about you? Grandkid feeling better?" Bill's face lit up. "Much better. That ear infection cleared right up. Thanks for asking." Little conversations like this were what got Frank through the nights. That, and thinking about what he'd make for Penny's breakfast before school. Tomorrow was Friday. Maybe he'd surprise her with pancakes shaped like music notes. She'd probably roll her eyes and say she was too old for that now, but he knew she'd still eat every bite. The elevator doors opened to the main floor, and Frank pushed his cart out. The lobby was massive, with high ceilings and shiny marble floors that took forever to clean. But the thing that always caught Frank's eye was the grand piano near the seating area. It was a beautiful instrument, polished black, lid propped open, sitting there like it was waiting for someone worthy to play it. Frank had been told it was only used during special events when the company hired professional musicians for fancy parties. Sometimes, when he was sure no one was around, Frank would walk over and just touch the keys lightly, not making a sound. It had been years since he'd really played. There was no room for a piano in their apartment and no money to buy one anyway. But his fingers still remembered. Tonight, as he approached the piano, Frank noticed the light was still on in the CEO's office upstairs. Ms. Harlow was known for working late, especially near the end of the quarter. Frank had cleaned around her many times, both of them pretending the other wasn't there. That was how it worked in places like this. The invisible. People stayed invisible. Frank ran his cloth over the piano's surface, carefully wiping away fingerprints and dust. As he did, he hummed quietly to himself, an old song he used to play for Rachel when they were young. Those had been different days, when possibilities seemed endless. After finishing with the piano, Frank got to work on the floors. The steady, back-and-forth motion of the mop was almost meditative. His mind wandered to the bills waiting at home. Rent was due next week, and Penny needed new shoes. The money was going to be tight, as always. Frank had started applying for better-paying jobs months ago. He'd put in applications at schools, hoping to get back into teaching, but no one seemed interested in a teacher who'd been out of the classroom for years. He'd even looked into office jobs, thinking his college degree might count for something, but those didn't pan out either. So here he was, at 42, mopping floors while wearing a name tag that simply said janitorial staff instead of his actual name. But when Frank thought about Penny, about the way she looked up from the piano with Rachel's smile after mastering a difficult piece, he knew he would clean 1,000 buildings if that's what it took to give her a chance at a better life. Frank finished mopping the lobby just as the clock hit 1 a.m. He still had to vacuum the CEO's office, then clean the break rooms on floors 10 through 15. It would be nearly 6 a.m. by the time he punched out. Then he'd head home, make breakfast for Penny, see her off to school, and try to get a few hours of sleep before picking her up. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself, but as Frank pushed his cart toward the elevator again, he thought about tomorrow evening, his one night off, when he would sit beside Penny at her practice piano at the community center. She'd been working on a Chopin piece for weeks now, one that Rachel used to play, the same one Frank had been humming while dusting the grand piano. And for a moment, despite the ache in his back and the worry about bills, Frank felt a small spark of joy. Because in those moments with Penny and the music, Rachel didn't feel so far away. And that was worth all the invisible nights, all the sore muscles, all the lonely hours. What Frank didn't know as he rode the elevator up to the CEO's office was that in just a few days, everything would change. The grand piano in the lobby wouldn't just be something to dust, and the people who had looked through him for years would finally see him, really see him, for the first time. The annual holiday party at Westfield Corporate Plaza was a big deal. Frank had worked through 3 of them already, always from a distance, cleaning up spills, emptying overflowing trash cans, and staying as invisible as possible while executives and their guests enjoyed the open bar and fancy food. This year's party was scheduled for Friday evening. Frank had asked his supervisor, Greg, if he could start his shift a little later so he could attend Penny's winter concert at school. "She's playing a solo," Frank had explained, trying not to sound like he was begging. Greg had sighed, but agreed. "Just make sure everything's spotless before the big shots arrive on Saturday morning," he'd said. On Wednesday night, 3 days before the party, Frank noticed the decorating team had already started transforming the building's grand atrium. Fake snow dusted the large potted plants. Twinkling lights hung from the ceiling, and the grand piano, usually just for show, had been moved to a more central spot, its lid fully open, ready for the professional musicians who would play during the event. Frank was cleaning the glass doors at the main entrance when he heard laughter coming from the direction of the elevator. A group of people emerged, talking loudly and moving with the loose energy of folks who'd had a few drinks. Frank recognized them as junior executives from the marketing department on the 11th floor. They'd stayed late for some kind of celebration. There were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women, all in their early 30s, all wearing the kind of clothes that cost more than Frank's monthly rent. One of them, A tall guy with carefully styled hair who Frank had heard others call Drew was carrying a bottle of champagne. "I still can't believe we landed the Henderson account," one of the women said, her high heels clicking on the marble floor. "That's because they hadn't met me yet," Drew replied with a grin, making the others laugh. "No one can resist the Preston charm." Frank kept his head down, focusing on wiping a smudge off the glass. He'd learned long ago that the best way to deal with executives after hours was to become part of the furniture. There, but not really there. The group moved toward the seating area near the piano, dropping onto the expensive leather couches. Drew popped open the champagne bottle, and the loud noise echoed through the empty lobby. Frank winced as some of the bubbly liquid spilled onto the floor he'd just mopped. "Hey, we need glasses," one of the other men called out. He had red hair and a loud voice. "Can't drink straight from the bottle like college kids." "Speak for yourself, Tyler," the second woman replied, grabbing the bottle and taking a swig before passing it on. Frank had finished with the doors and was about to head to the janitor's closet for a fresh mop when Drew spotted him. "Hey, cleaning guy," he called out. "You know where we can find some glasses?" Frank paused. "There might be some in the break room on this floor," he said quietly. "I can check for you." "That would be great," Drew said, flashing what he probably thought was a charming smile. "And while you're at it, maybe you could clean up this little spill?" "Thanks, buddy." The way he said buddy made it clear Frank was anything but. Still, Frank nodded and headed for the break room. He found 6 clean glasses in the cabinet and brought them back on a tray he'd wiped down. "Perfect timing," Tyler exclaimed as Frank set the tray down on the coffee table. "Our hero," the group laughed again as Frank knelt to wipe up the champagne spill. He could feel their eyes on his back, the weight of their amusement at his expense. It wasn't mean exactly, more thoughtless, as if they couldn't imagine him as a real person with feelings. "So what's the deal with the piano?" one of the women asked. "Is someone famous playing at the holiday party?" "I heard they hired some jazz quartet," Drew replied. "Cost a fortune according to Debbie in accounting." Frank finished cleaning the spill and was about to leave when he noticed a small scratch on the piano's surface. Without thinking, he pulled out his polish cloth and moved toward the instrument. "Whoa, careful there," Drew called out. "That thing probably costs more than you make in a year." More laughter. Frank felt his cheeks grow warm, but he kept his face neutral. The piano was indeed expensive, a Steinway concert grand that had to be worth at least $100,000. But Frank knew how to handle a piano. He'd been doing it since he was 8 years old. As he gently polished the scratch, his hand brushed against one of the keys, making a soft note ring out. "Hey." Tyler suddenly perked up, the champagne making his voice even louder. "Do you play, Janitor man?" Frank looked up, surprised by the direct question. "I used to," he said simply. This seemed to delight the group. They exchanged glances, a new form of entertainment presenting itself. "Well, go on then," Drew encouraged, waving his champagne glass. "Give us a little show, play something." Frank shook his head. "I should get back to work." "Come on," one of the women urged. She had blonde hair cut in an expensive-looking bob. "Just one song. We won't tell your boss." "Yeah," Tyler added, "unless you can't actually play and we're just making that up." Frank looked at their expectant faces. They thought this was funny, the idea of the janitor trying to play this magnificent instrument. They were expecting him to embarrass himself, to plink out chopsticks or fumble through heart and soul so they could have another laugh. For a moment, Frank considered just walking away. He had floors to mop, trash to empty, bathrooms to clean. He didn't owe these people a performance, but something inside him, maybe pride, maybe the memory of who he used to be, or maybe just the thought of Penny practicing so hard for her concert, made him set down his cleaning cloth. "One song," he said quietly. The group whooped and settled back on the couches, champagne glasses raised like they were at a comedy show. Frank could see it in their eyes. They were waiting for the punchline. He sat down on the bench, adjusting it slightly. It had been so long since he'd played a piano this nice. He took a breath and placed his hands on the keys. Should he play something simple? Something they might recognize? As his fingers rested on the cool ivory, a different thought came to him. Why give them what they expected? Frank closed his eyes and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the atrium. His fingers remembered every note, every subtle change in pressure needed to make the piece sing. The music flowed from him as if no time had passed since he'd last played on a real piano. The rich, complex melody echoed off the marble and glass, creating a sound so full and beautiful that Frank felt a lump form in his throat. This was the piece Rachel had loved most, the piece he'd been teaching Penny, a few measures at a time, on the worn-out piano at the community center. He forgot about the executives watching him, forgot about his janitor's uniform and his aching back, forgot about the late hour and the work still waiting to be done. There was only the music, sad and sweet and hopeful all at once. When Frank reached the middle section where the melody grows more intense, he opened his eyes briefly. The expressions on the executives' faces had transformed. Gone were the smirks and the expectant looks. Instead, they stared at him with wide eyes and slightly open mouths. Drew had set down his champagne glass. The blonde woman was sitting forward on the couch. All traces of amusement vanished. Frank closed his eyes again and continued playing. His hands moved across the keys with the confidence of someone who had spent thousands of hours mastering this instrument. Each note was perfectly timed, each phrase shaped with care. As he played the final section, Frank thought of Penny and how proud she would be to hear him playing like this again. He thought of Rachel and how she used to close her eyes just as he was doing now, letting the music wash over her. The last notes hung in the air like a question left unanswered. For several seconds after Frank's hands left the keys, there was complete silence in the atrium. Then he heard a sound from behind him, a single person clapping slowly. Frank turned around, expecting to see one of the executives. Instead, he found himself looking at Ms. Harlow, the CEO. She stood near the elevator, an expression on her face that Frank couldn't quite read. How long had she been standing there? Had she heard the whole piece? "That was beautiful," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the large space. Unlike the others, there was no surprise in her tone, only appreciation. Frank stood up quickly, suddenly very aware of the late hour and the work he hadn't finished. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm sorry. I should get back to—" "No," Ms. Harlow said, holding up her hand. "Don't apologize for that." She walked closer, her heels making sharp sounds on the marble floor. The marketing executive sat frozen, champagne forgotten. Ms. Harlow stopped a few feet from Frank. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked. Frank swallowed, unsure how much to say. Would he get in trouble for stopping his work to play the piano? But something in her eyes made him answer honestly. "I studied at the conservatory," he said. "I used to teach music before." He trailed off, not wanting to share his whole life story with this woman who signed his paychecks. Ms. Harlow nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "Well," she said finally, "it seems we have much to discuss, Mr. Baker," Frank supplied. "Frank Baker. Mr. Baker," she repeated, as if committing the name to memory. "I believe I'll see you at Friday's party after all." With that, she turned and walked back toward the elevator, leaving Frank standing by the piano, wondering what had just happened. Behind him, the marketing team sat in stunned silence, the joke they'd intended completely forgotten. Frank barely slept the next day. His mind kept replaying what had happened, the way the music had flowed from his fingers after so many years, the shocked faces of the executives, and most of all, the look in Ms. Harlow's eyes when she'd said they had much to discuss. What did that mean? Was he in trouble for playing the piano instead of cleaning, or was it something else entirely? By the time Friday evening rolled around, Frank was a bundle of nerves. He'd picked up Penny from school and taken her to her winter concert, where she'd played her solo piece beautifully. Frank had clapped until his hands hurt, his heart so full of pride it felt like it might burst. "You were amazing," he told her as they walked home in the cold December air. Mom would have been so proud. Penny had smiled up at him, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Frank replied. "She's watching over you, kiddo. Over both of us." After dropping Penny at Mrs. Rivera's apartment, Frank changed into his work uniform and headed to Westfield Plaza. The building was transformed. Everywhere he looked, there were decorations, catering staff setting up food stations, and workers adjusting lighting. The holiday party would start in just 2 hours, and Frank had been instructed to help with last-minute cleaning before the guests arrived. He was mopping a spill near the entrance when Greg, his supervisor, approached him. Greg was a heavy-set man with a perpetual look of stress on his face. "Baker," he called out. "Ms. Harlow's office wants you upstairs, right now." Frank's stomach dropped. Did they say why? Greg shrugged. "Not my business, just go." With a growing sense of dread, Frank put away his mop and headed for the elevator. What if Ms. Harlow was upset about him playing the piano? What if she thought he was slacking off on the job? He couldn't afford to lose this position, not with rent due and Penny's piano lessons to pay for. The executive floor was quiet when he arrived. Most of the staff had gone home to change for the party. Frank made his way to Ms. Harlow's office, his footsteps sounding too loud in the empty hallway. He knocked softly on the door. "Come in," called a voice from inside. Frank entered to find Ms. Harlow sitting behind her large desk. She was already dressed for the party in a dark blue dress, her silver hair styled elegantly. Next to her stood a man Frank didn't recognize, tall, with kind eyes and a bow tie. "Mr. Baker," Ms. Harlow said, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit down." Frank sat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Ma'am, if this is about what happened with the piano, Ms. Harlow held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "This is absolutely about what happened with the piano," she said. Then, to Frank's surprise, she smiled. "But not in the way you think." She turned to the man beside her. "This is Robert Chen, our Director of Community Outreach. Robert, this is Frank Baker." The man named Robert extended his hand, which Frank shook hesitantly. "Mr. Baker," Ms. Harlow continued, "I've been in business for 30 years. In that time, I've learned to recognize exceptional talent when I see it. What I witnessed Wednesday night was nothing short of extraordinary." Frank blinked, unsure how to respond. "Robert has been working on a new initiative for Westfield," she explained. "We're launching a music program for underprivileged children in the community. We've been looking for someone to lead it, someone with both musical expertise and teaching experience." Frank's heart began to race. Was this really happening? "After hearing you play," Ms. Harlow said, "I did some checking. You were a music teacher for 12 years at Lincoln High School. You have a master's degree in music education from Northwestern. Your former principal described you as the most gifted teacher to ever walk through our doors." Frank swallowed hard. "That was a long time ago." "Not so long," Robert chimed in. "Skills like yours don't disappear. Your performance the other night proved that." Ms. Harlow leaned forward. "Mr. Baker, we'd like to offer you a position as the director of our new Westfield Community Music Program. The salary would be—" She named a figure that made Frank's eyes widen. It was more than triple what he made as a janitor. "I don't understand," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you offer this to me? You don't even know me." Ms. Harlow's expression softened. "Sometimes life gives us unexpected chances to right wrongs. 3 years ago, our company acquired the school district management company that made the budget cuts that eliminated your position. I signed off on those cuts without understanding the human cost." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I can't undo the past, Mr. Baker, but I can offer you a future that matches your talents." Frank sat in stunned silence. Was this really happening? After 3 years of struggling, of watching his life shrink to smaller and smaller spaces, was this door really opening? I don't know what to say, he finally managed. "Say yes," Robert urged with a warm smile. "We need someone like you. The program launches in January. You'd have time to finish out the month here if you wanted, or start right away with planning." Frank thought of Penny, of how her face would light up when he told her. No more night shifts. No more worrying about making rent. Maybe even someday a piano of their own again. Yes, he said, his voice stronger now. Yes, I'd be honored. Ms. Harlow smiled and stood up. Excellent. Robert will get you the paperwork on Monday. In the meantime, she glanced at her watch. The party starts in an hour. I believe our hired pianist has called in sick. Frank looked at her in surprise. You want me to play? At the party? If you're willing, she replied. Consider it your debut as a Westfield employee rather than part of the janitorial staff. An hour later, Frank found himself sitting at the grand piano in the atrium, wearing a borrowed suit jacket over his cleanest shirt. The space had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with ice sculptures and twinkling lights everywhere. Executives and their guests mingled, holding champagne glasses and sampling fancy hors d'oeuvres. Many of them glanced curiously at Frank, clearly wondering who he was. The marketing team from Wednesday night stood in a corner, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and awe as they recognized him. Frank took a deep breath and began to play. He started with classical pieces, Bach, Mozart, Debussy, then transitioned to holiday songs as the evening progressed. His fingers moved across the keys with confidence, bringing music to life in a way that made conversations pause and people turn to listen. During a short break, Ms. Harlow approached the piano with a glass of water for him. You play beautifully, she said. Our guests are impressed. Thank you, Frank replied. For everything. She nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. I should be thanking you. It's not often we get the chance to discover hidden talent within our own walls. As she walked away, Frank noticed Drew, the marketing executive who had first challenged him to play, approaching hesitantly. I owe you an apology, Drew said, looking genuinely contrite. What I did was rude and thoughtless. Frank considered. The young man. A week ago, he might have just nodded and turned away, keeping his thoughts to himself as he'd learned to do. But something had changed. He wasn't just the invisible janitor anymore. Thank you for saying that, Frank replied. Sometimes life puts us in boxes, makes us see people only one way. The trick is learning to look beyond the labels. Drew nodded, seeming to really hear him. You're incredible, you know. Where did you learn to play like that? For the first time in years, Frank felt a sense of pride in talking about his past. I started when I was 8, he began. My mother cleaned houses for a family with a piano. As the party continued around them, Frank shared bits of his story. Not as someone looking for pity, but as an equal, a person with a past, a present, and now, remarkably, a future filled with possibility again. Later that night, when the last guests had left and the catering staff was cleaning up, Frank slipped away to call Mrs. Rivera's apartment. Could I speak to Penny, please? He asked when she answered. I have some news that can't wait until morning. When his daughter's sleepy voice came on the line, Frank felt tears prick at his eyes. Hey, sweetheart, he said. How would you feel about me teaching piano again? And maybe, he paused, his heart full, maybe about us having a piano of our own? The joy in Penny's voice as she bombarded him with questions made everything, all the struggle, all the hard nights, all the moments of despair, worth it. As Frank walked home through the quiet city streets that night, snowflakes beginning to fall around him, he felt Rachel's presence beside him. We're going to be okay, he whispered to the night sky. Better than okay. And for the first time in 3 years, he truly believed it. The first day of January brought more than just a new year for Frank and Penny. It brought a fresh start. Frank stood in the empty room on the 3rd floor of Westfield Plaza, running his hand along the wall. This space, with its large windows overlooking the city park, would become the home of the Westfield Community Music Program. His program. What do you think, kiddo? He asked Penny, who was spinning in circles in the middle of the room, her winter coat still zipped up to her chin. It's huge, she exclaimed. How many pianos will fit in here? Frank laughed. Well, we'll have 2 grand pianos to start, and some keyboards for the group lessons. Maybe a small area for string instruments, too. Penny stopped spinning and looked at her dad with serious eyes. Will you teach me here now instead of going to Ms. Chen? Frank walked over and knelt in front of his daughter, Ms. Chen is still your teacher, honey. I'll be busy running the whole program. But you can practice here anytime you want. That seemed to satisfy her. She resumed her exploration of the room, peeking into closets and checking the view from each window. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind. After the holiday party, Frank had worked his final shifts as a janitor while beginning to plan for his new role. Robert Chen had been incredibly helpful, introducing Frank to the Westfield Foundation board members and walking him through the budget for the program. The goal was simple, but meaningful: provide free music education to children who couldn't afford lessons. The program would start small, maybe 20 students, but had room to grow. And the best part? Frank would have complete creative control. "Mr. Baker?" A voice called from the doorway. Frank turned to see a young woman with curly hair and a clipboard. "That's me," he replied. "I'm Nancy from Facilities," she said, stepping into the room. "I'm here to discuss the renovations. We can install soundproofing on these walls, and there's space for storage cabinets along the back." As they talked through the plans, Frank felt a strange mix of excitement and disbelief. Just a month ago, he had been the invisible man mopping these floors. Now people like Nancy were asking for his input on renovation plans. "Dad!" Penny called from across the room. "There's another room through here." Frank excused himself and followed his daughter's voice. She had discovered a smaller room connected to the main space, perfect for one-on-one lessons or perhaps an office. "This could be your special room," he told her, "for practicing when you don't want an audience." Penny beamed at him. There was a lightness to her these days that made Frank's heart ache in the best possible way. She looked more like Rachel than ever, the same spark in her eyes, the same determined set to her chin when she was excited about something. After finishing with Nancy, Frank took Penny to lunch in the building's cafe, another new experience. As a janitor, he'd never felt comfortable eating in the public areas of Westfield Plaza. Now, sitting across from his daughter as she happily munched on a sandwich, he marveled at how quickly life could change. "Frank, there you are." Frank looked up to see Robert Chen approaching their table, bow tie slightly askew as usual. "Robert, hi. This is my daughter, Penny. Penny, this is Mr. Chen, the man I told you about." Penny offered her hand very formally, making both men smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Chen. Dad says you're helping him with the music program." "That's right," Robert replied, shaking her hand. "And I hear you're quite the pianist yourself." Penny nodded seriously. "I'm learning Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It's really hard." "That's impressive," Robert said, clearly not just humoring her. "That piece is challenging even for advanced players." He turned to Frank. "I won't interrupt your lunch for long, but I wanted to let you know the pianos will be delivered next Tuesday. And Ms. Harlow was hoping you could stop by her office before you leave today. She has some news about potential students." After Robert left, Frank noticed Penny watching him with a thoughtful expression. "What's on your mind?" he asked. She pushed a potato chip around her plate. "Is this really happening? Dad? Are we really going to be okay now?" The question hit Frank hard. He sometimes forgot how much Penny had understood about their struggles over the past 3 years, how careful he'd had to be with money, how tired he often was from working long hours. "Yes," he said firmly. "We're going to be more than okay. I promise." Later that afternoon, after dropping Penny at Mrs. Rivera's, who had insisted on continuing to watch her even though Frank could now afford after-school care, Frank headed to Ms. Harlow's office. She greeted him warmly, the formality of their first meetings replaced by a more collegial relationship. "Frank, come in. How are the renovations coming along?" "Great," he replied, taking a seat. "We should be ready for the piano delivery next week." "Excellent." She pulled a folder from her desk drawer. "I have something exciting to share. The East Side Community Center has 15 children already signed up for your program. Their director called me personally." Frank took the folder, which contained information about each child, their ages, any previous music experience, family circumstances. As he scanned the pages, he felt a growing sense of purpose. These kids reminded him of his students from Lincoln High, eager to learn but facing tough odds. "This is perfect," he said. When can I meet them? They're hoping you might visit the center next Thursday, Ms. Harlow replied. Perhaps do a small demonstration? Frank nodded, already thinking about what pieces he might play, how to engage children of different ages. There's one more thing, Ms. Harlow added, her tone changing slightly. The Henderson Corporation, our newest client, has expressed interest in sponsoring the program. They'd like to provide scholarships for 5 additional students. Frank raised his eyebrows. Henderson? Isn't that the account the marketing team was celebrating? Ms. Harlow smiled. The very same. In fact, it was Drew Patterson who suggested the sponsorship. I believe he was quite moved by your playing at the holiday party. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. The same person who had mockingly challenged him to play the piano was now helping fund his program. Life had a strange way of coming full circle sometimes. As January turned to February, the Westfield Community Music Program took shape. The renovated space now held 2 gleaming grand pianos, a row of keyboards, and comfortable chairs for both students and parents. The walls were painted a warm yellow, and framed sheet music from famous composers added character to the room. Frank's days were now filled with lessons, administrative work, and planning. He'd hired 2 part-time teachers to help, one for strings and another for voice, but he handled most of the piano instruction himself. On a Tuesday afternoon, as Frank was working with 10-year-old Luis on a simplified version of Fur-Elise, he noticed someone watching from the doorway. It was Drew Patterson, the marketing executive. Keep practicing that section, Frank told Luis. I'll be right back. He approached Drew, who looked different somehow, less polished, more human. Here to check on your company's investment? Frank asked, but his tone was friendly. Drew shook his head. Actually, I came to ask a favor. I used to play piano as a kid. Gave it up in high school because it wasn't cool. But hearing you that night, I was wondering if you might have room for an adult student. I'd pay full price, of course. Frank hadn't expected this. You want to take lessons? Drew nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. If you're willing to teach me. I'm probably terrible now, but... Wednesday evenings, Frank interrupted. I have a slot at 6:30. We can start next week if that works for you. The gratitude on Drew's face was genuine. That would be great, thank you. As Drew left, Frank returned to Luis, who was still working diligently on his Beethoven. Looking around the room at the children focused on their music, some from wealthy families, others from struggling households just like his own had been, Frank felt a sense of completion. That evening, as he and Penny walked home, she asked about his day. It was good, he said. Really good. Did you make anyone cry with your playing? She asked with a grin. Frank laughed. Not today, but there's always tomorrow. They stopped at a small music shop on their way home, something that would have been unthinkable just months ago. The bell jingled as they entered, and the owner, Mr. Lopez, greeted them by name. It's ready, he told Frank with a smile. In the back of the shop sat an upright piano, not new but beautifully restored. The warm wood gleamed under the shop lights. Is that ours? Penny whispered, her eyes wide. Frank nodded, his throat suddenly tight with emotion. It's coming, home with us today. As Penny ran her fingers reverently over the keys, Frank thought about Rachel, how she would have loved to see this moment. Their daughter sitting at their very own piano again, their lives finally expanding instead of contracting. Mr. Lopez handed Frank the receipt. First payment's all set, he said. Take good care of her. This model's from the 1940s. They don't make them like this anymore. That night, after the piano had been delivered to their apartment, they'd moved to a larger one in a better building, though Frank had insisted on staying in the same neighborhood. Penny played for hours. The Chopin piece was coming along beautifully, her small hands growing more confident with each practice session. Frank sat on the couch, just listening. The music filled their home again, just as it had years ago. And though the path that had brought them here was full of unexpected turns, he wouldn't have changed a single note. 6 months flew by faster than Frank could have imagined. Spring turned to summer, and the Westfield Community Music Program blossomed, like the flowers in the park across from their building. What had started as a small initiative with 20 students had grown to over 50. Word had spread through the community about the free lessons, the beautiful space, and most of all, the passionate teacher who had once been the building's janitor. On a warm June morning, Frank sat in his small office, looking over the schedule for their upcoming summer recital. His phone buzzed with a text from Ms. Harlow. "Board meeting at 11. Bring your proposal for the fall expansion." Frank smiled. The expansion had been his idea, adding a choir program and more string instruments. He'd spent weeks working on the budget and curriculum, determined to make music accessible to even more children. A knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door opened to reveal Luis, the 10-year-old who had been one of his first students. "Mr. Baker, can I practice during lunch? My mom's picking me up early today." "Of course," Frank replied. "Piano 2 is free all lunch hour. Just make sure you eat something too, okay?" Luis nodded and hurried off, his sheet music clutched to his chest. Frank watched him go with a sense of pride. In 6 months, Luis had progressed from simple melodies to complex pieces. His mother cleaned houses for a living, much like Frank's mother had, and Luis had inherited her determination. Frank gathered his proposal materials and headed upstairs for the board meeting. As he rode the elevator, he thought about how strange it still felt sometimes to be heading to the executive floor as a program director, rather than as the man who emptied the trash cans. The meeting went well. The board members, impressed by the program's success, approved the expansion unanimously. As people began to leave the conference room, Ms. Harlow motioned for Frank to stay behind. "I have news," she said once they were alone. "The National Arts Foundation got wind of our program. They're interested in featuring us in their annual showcase next month." Frank blinked in surprise. That's amazing. How did they hear about us?" "Apparently one of our students' parents works for them. They visited incognito last month during lessons." Ms. Harlow smiled. "They were particularly impressed by your teaching methods. The showcase would mean national exposure for the program, and potentially more funding." Frank's mind raced with possibilities as he headed back to his office. As he passed the main music room, he paused to watch his string teacher working with a group of young violinists. Their small faces were screwed up in concentration as they attempted a simple tune together. The sound was far from perfect, squeaky and slightly out of tune, but the joy on their faces when they finished was worth more than any polished performance. Later that afternoon, Frank was helping Penny with a particularly challenging passage of a Beethoven sonata when his phone rang. It was Bill, the night security guard from his janitor days. "Frank, hope I'm not interrupting." Bill's familiar voice boomed through the speaker. "Not at all," Frank replied, motioning for Penny to keep practicing. "What's up?" "Just wanted to make sure you're coming to my retirement party next week. 40 years at Westfield, can you believe it?" Frank promised he would be there. Bill had been one of the few people who had treated him like a human being during his janitorial days. The old guard had been genuinely happy about Frank's change in fortune, never once acting jealous or resentful. As Frank hung up, he noticed Penny watching him. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said with a small smile. "It's just nice to see you. Happy, Dad." Frank reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've always been happy when I'm with you, kiddo." "I know," she replied. "But now you're happy even when you come home from work, and you don't look tired all the time." Out of the mouths of babes, Frank thought. He hadn't realized how much his exhaustion and stress had shown, how much Penny had noticed during those difficult years. The next week brought the final preparations for the summer recital. Students practiced with increased intensity, parents called with last-minute questions about the program, and Frank worked late into the evenings making sure everything would be perfect. The day before the recital, Frank received an unexpected visitor. Greg, his former supervisor from the janitorial department, stopped by the music room. "Place looks different," Greg commented, glancing around at the pianos and music stands. "Greg," Frank said, surprised. "What brings you up here?" The older man shifted uncomfortably. "Heard about your recital tomorrow. Thought I might stop by if that's okay." Frank hadn't seen much of Greg since changing positions. There had been no bad blood between them, but they hadn't been close either. "Of course," Frank said. "We'd be happy to have you." Greg nodded, then hesitated. "Look, I just wanted to say, I'm glad things worked out for you. You were always too good for janitorial, too smart. I should have said something sooner." The unexpected admission caught Frank off guard. "You gave me the job when I needed it most," he replied honestly. That's what mattered. After Greg left, Frank sat at one of the grand pianos thinking about how life could change so completely. A year ago, he had been mopping floors and worrying about making rent. Now he was directing a music program that was about to be nationally recognized. That evening, as Frank and Penny ate dinner in their apartment, he told her about the National Arts Foundation's interest in the program. "Does that mean you'll be famous?" she asked, eyes wide. Frank laughed. "Hardly, but it means our program might be able to help even more kids learn music." Penny nodded thoughtfully. "Like you helped me keep learning even when things were hard." "Exactly. Like that," Frank agreed. The day of the recital arrived bright and clear. The atrium of Westfield Plaza had been transformed with rows of chairs facing the grand piano. Parents, siblings, and friends filtered in, programs in hand, excitement on their faces. Backstage, which was really just a cordoned-off area of the hallway, Frank moved from student to student, offering last-minute advice and encouragement. "Remember to breathe," he told Luis, who was opening the show with his Bach piece. "What if I mess up?" Luis whispered, fingers fidgeting with his tie. Frank knelt down to eye level with the boy. "Then you keep going. That's what musicians do. We don't stop when we hit a wrong note. We just make it part of the journey." The recital began, and Frank watched with pride as his students performed one after another. Some played perfectly, others hit wrong notes or lost their place momentarily, but each one finished to enthusiastic applause. In the audience, Frank could see Ms. Harlow sitting next to Robert Chen. Drew from marketing was there too, now a dedicated, adult student. Greg had come as promised and was sitting near the back. And scattered throughout were the parents of his students, some in business attire, others in work uniforms, all beaming with pride as their children performed. Penny was scheduled to close the show. As she walked to the piano, Frank felt his heart swell. She had grown so much in the past 6 months, not just as a musician but as a person. The confidence in her posture, the grace with which she adjusted the bench, all spoke of a child becoming comfortable in her own skin. She began to play the Chopin Nocturne, the same piece Frank had played that fateful night when he was asked to perform as a joke. But in Penny's hands, the piece took on a different quality. Where Frank's interpretation had been full of buried pain and longing, Penny's version sparkled with hope and possibility. As the final notes faded, there was a moment of perfect silence before the audience erupted in applause. Penny stood and bowed, her face flushed with the thrill of performance. Frank made his way to the piano for his closing remarks, hugging Penny briefly as she passed him. Looking out at the audience, at all these people who had come together, because of music, he felt a sense of completion. "Thank you all for coming today," he began. "When we started this program 6 months ago, I had a simple goal: to give children the chance to experience the joy of music, regardless of their background or circumstances." He paused, gathering his thoughts. What I didn't expect was how much these students would give back to me, how much they would remind me of the power of music to connect us, to heal us, to help us express what words alone cannot. From the corner of his eye, Frank could see Ms. Harlow discreetly wiping away a tear. "Someone once asked me why I teach music," he continued. "The answer is simple. Because music taught me that even in our darkest moments, beauty is possible, that after every difficult passage there can be resolution, that harmony often comes after discord." As Frank concluded his speech and invited everyone to the reception, he felt a presence beside him, Penny had returned to the stage, slipping her hand into his. Together they faced the audience, father and daughter, teacher and student, two musicians who had weathered the hard times and come out stronger. Later, as they mingled with guests, at the reception, Ms. Harlow approached them. "Penny, that was a beautiful performance," she said. "You must be very proud, Frank." "I am," Frank replied, looking at his daughter. "Of everything." Ms. Harlow's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, a year ago, if someone had told me our janitor would become one of our most valuable program directors, I might not have believed them. It makes me wonder how many other people we pass every day whose talents go unseen." Frank nodded. "We're all more than our job titles." As the reception wound down and the last guests left, Frank and Penny walked through the atrium one last time. The chairs were being cleared away, the refreshment tables dismantled, but the grand piano still stood center stage, its lid propped open. "Can we play one more time, Dad?" Penny asked. "Together?" Frank smiled and led her to the bench. Side by side, they began to play a duet version of the Chopin Nocturne, the piece that had changed their lives. As their hands moved across the keys, creating music that filled the empty atrium, Frank thought about the journey that had brought them here. The wrong notes, the difficult passages, the unexpected key changes. And yet, somehow, the melody had found its way to this perfect moment. Sometimes, he realized, the most beautiful compositions came from the most unlikely beginnings.